For a surgeon, pulling back-to-back shifts in the operating room was a familiar rhythm, a life measured in beeps and sutures. So, when the call from Dr. Albright, the chief of surgery, shattered the quiet of his apartment after midnight, Dr. Elias Vance felt no particular annoyance. He was simply summoned. His reputation at Port Gallows General was sterling. His hands were steady, his technique innovative. He was the one they called for the complex cases, the Hail Mary procedures that older surgeons shied away from. Tonight, however, felt different. He was already in the surgical prep room, yet he hadn't seen a patient chart, hadn't even been briefed on the procedure. A profound breach of protocol that coiled like a cold snake in his gut. While pulling on his blue scrubs, Elias listened to the hushed, anxious chatter of the nurses. They spoke of a new outbreak of the contamination sickness along the coast. Nurse Jenkins, her face etched with worry, recounted a news report that claimed it was a mutation, a new strain originating from an offshore drilling disaster years ago that had poisoned the Pacific Shelf. She said the CDC had already quarantined 3 towns up north. Elias remarked quietly that it wasn't just the coast. There had been inland clusters, too. The cause was something more than a simple chemical spill. A junior nurse, surprised, asked how he could be so sure. Elias stated pinged Ly that his own father had been one of the first victims of the sickness. The government had taken him away the day after the symptoms appeared. Elias recalled the winter cold, the sight of his father's head swelling to the size of a waterlogged basketball. A grotesque second face beginning to emerge from the fleshy tumor on the back of his skull. It had been the happiest day of his life. The young nurse mumbled an apology, her eyes downcast. Elias reassured her it was of no consequence to him. Dr. Marcus Riley, another surgeon scrubbed in for the mysterious operation, nervously pulled out his phone, his movements jerky. He told them his friend, a journalist embedded with the National Guard, had just sent him something from one of the northern quarantine zones. Elias couldn't resist leaning in for a look. The video was chaotic, clearly filmed in secret. The shaky camera pointed at the rain-slicked pavement of a city street at night, the asphalt gleaming under the cold, white light of street lamps and reflecting the hard edges of military riot shields. The background was a cacophony of screams and automatic gunfire. Then the camera tilted upwards. A collective gasp went through the room. Elias felt the air leave his own lungs. In his experience, the contamination sickness resulted in severe physical deformities, tumors, bone spurs, abnormal brain growth, but the victims always retained a fundamentally human shape. The thing in the video, however, was an abomination that defied classification. It stood in the doorway of an office building, a vaguely humanoid silhouette against the dim light. It had no head. In its place, a mass of thick, powerful tentacles erupted from its neck, making it look like a grotesque, weeping willow tree. Each tentacle was in constant motion, and from the tip of each one dangled the limp, broken body of a soldier. Blood dripped from the corpses, sizzling as it hit the marble steps. A commanding officer's voice, tight with a terror he couldn't quite conceal, yelled for his men to open fire. The resulting barrage was deafening. A storm of lead that tore through the creature's torso, blasting chunks of flesh and viscera into the night. The monster collapsed into a heap of mangled tissue and lay still. In the video, someone could be heard asking if it was over. But a second later, the mass of tentacles began to stir, dragging the ruined torso forward 1 agonizing inch. The video cut to black. A heavy silence descended upon the prep room. Someone, a resident trying to sound brave, suggested it was just a viral marketing campaign for a horror movie. He commented on the impressive quality of the special effects. But Dr. Riley, his face pale as bleached bone, hugged his arms and whispered a question about what they would do if it was real. He noted that while the sickness had been around for years, the outbreaks had always been small and contained. Elias remained silent. His last name, Vance, belied a man of few words. He was methodically pulling on his surgical gloves when the door swung open again. Dr. Albright entered, followed by 3 men who were clearly not medical personnel. Elias knew at a glance they were military. They carried themselves with a rigid discipline, a coiled lethality in their posture that made them seem stamped from the same mold. Albright, normally a jovial man with a face like a friendly bulldog, looked grim. He scanned the room and announced in a strained voice that standard surgical gear wasn't enough. They were to put on the full Level 3 hazmat suits. A young resident blanched, wondering aloud if they were dealing with a new Ebola. Before Albright could answer, one of the military men stepped forward. He introduced himself as Captain Cole Armstrong and explained that the patient was a member of his unit who had been wounded during a containment operation. He had contracted the sickness, and they were hoping a surgical excision of the afflicted area could save him. Armstrong then informed them that before proceeding, they would all need to sign a non-disclosure agreement, emphasizing that participation was entirely voluntary. A nurse nervously asked if it was the same contamination from the offshore spill. Armstrong turned a hard, assessing gaze on her and stated flatly that it was not. He added that he wished it were that simple. Hesitation rippled through the room. To save a patient was their duty, but not at the cost of their own lives. Elias simply asked where he needed to sign. Dr. Albright, mopping sweat from his brow, produced a stack of documents. Elias gave the agreement a cursory scan, the usual boilerplate about confidentiality, no photos, no public statements, and signed his name with a firm, decisive stroke. In the end, only 3 doctors remained: Albright, Elias, and Riley. 2 nurses also stayed. There was no anesthesiologist. And they had one special guest. Captain Armstrong himself would be observing. Under normal circumstances, a non-medical observer in the OR was unthinkable, but these were not normal circumstances. A nurse joked morbidly that if the patient didn't make it, Armstrong might just pull a gun and shoot them all. Elias noted the distinct bulge of a sidearm under the captain's tactical jacket. The surgical lights hummed, illuminating an empty operating table. A minute later, 2 of Armstrong's men wheeled in a cylindrical metal pod. Elias looked at Dr. Albright, a man whose name was already in medical textbooks, and saw that the veteran surgeon's hands were trembling. The pod hissed open, releasing a blast of frigid air. The patient was transferred to the table. The moment he saw the man, Dr. Riley turned and vomited into a waste bin. Nurse Jenkins's voice was a choked, horrified whisper as she asked what that was. The patient's abdomen was completely covered in a dense cluster of pulsating, semi-translucent sacs. Under the glare of the surgical lamps, the sacs revealed what was gestating inside. Countless tiny, dark shapes, like fetal fish, swam and writhed with a vibrant, sickening energy. The sacs seemed to have grown directly from the man's body, stretching his skin taut over their surfaces, the underlying layers of fat and tissue clearly visible. They were packed together like a monstrous clutch of caviar. Elias thought it looked like the spawning grounds of some deep-sea leviathan. Armstrong's men efficiently strapped the patient to the table with practiced ease. From across the room, the captain explained that the man had been parasitized by a Class C contaminant and was entering the 2nd stage of gestation. He said their own scientists believed that if the growths were removed, adjuvant therapy might offer a chance of recovery. He acknowledged the urgency of the situation and the impossibility of getting the man back to a secure lab in time, and trusting him to their care. He offered a single piece of reassurance. The roe were simple parasites and posed no risk of secondary infection to healthy individuals. Elias possessed a profound, almost unnatural calm, a trait that had served him well since the first time he'd held a scalpel. It served him now. After the initial shock, he was the first to approach the table, ready to begin. The patient's breathing was shallow, but it was clear he was not insensate. Each time Elias excised one of the sacs, the man's body convulsed, his face flushing a deep crimson. The removed sacs shriveled instantly, like sea creatures deprived of water, and were dropped into a special disposal unit filled with a chemical solution. High temperatures couldn't kill the eggs, but the solution would render them inert. Elias looked up and asked why they weren't using anesthesia. Even with restraints, the patient's muscle spasms were hindering the procedure. Armstrong paused before replying that if they put him under, he might never wake up. As the hours wore on, a grim efficiency settled over the surgical team. They managed to control the bleeding, keeping it within an acceptable range. But deep into the third hour, a lapse in concentration, born of sheer exhaustion, caused Dr. Riley's scalpel to slip, slicing through his own glove. The viscous fluid from a punctured sac flooded his hand. He screamed, a raw, primal sound of terror. He declared he was done, that he was quitting, and begged them to let him go. He threw his scalpel down and bolted from the room. Armstrong's jaw tightened, but he made no move to stop him. He knew Riley wouldn't get past the hospital's security cordon. He'd be sedated and taken for evaluation. The surgery continued for another 90 minutes. Finally, Elias removed the last sac, located deep in the thoracic cavity. Dr. Albright, an old man pushed beyond his limits, swayed on his feet, overcome by a wave of vertigo the moment he set down his instruments. He managed to tell Armstrong that the procedure was a success. For the first time, a flicker of a smile touched the captain's lips. Elias, however, noticed something else. As he glanced at the patient's hand, he saw a subtle movement beneath the skin, something dark and fluid moving within a vein. The patient, a soldier of incredible fortitude, had endured the entire unanesthetized ordeal with little more than gritted teeth. Now his fingers twitched, a desperate, tiny movement. He was trying to get their attention. Elias met the man's eyes. They were filled with tears, a silent, desperate plea for help. On pure instinct, Elias brought his scalpel down, making a shallow incision on the back of the patient's hand. A spray of tiny, golden eggs erupted from the wound. Armstrong's face transformed in an instant. The deafening crack of a gunshot echoed in the enclosed space. The nurses shrieked and huddled together. Elias had performed countless emergency surgeries, had lost patients on the table before, but he had never imagined a life ending this way. Blood and viscera splattered across his hazmat suit. He had been too close to dodge. Dr. Albright's legs gave out, and he crumpled to the floor. Armstrong lowered his sidearm, his voice filled with a chillingly detached apology. He admitted his assessment had been wrong. The patient had already entered the third stage. He explained that contamination was inevitable at that point, and culling the host was the only option. He assured them that a liaison would be in contact regarding compensation. Elias stared, numb, at the mutilated body on the table. Armstrong's men moved in silently to bag the corpse. It wouldn't go to the morgue. It would be sealed in a containment pod and incinerated at high temperature. With a final, formal apology for the scene they had been forced to witness, Armstrong and his team departed, leaving the surgical staff in stunned silence. Dr. Albright, still on the floor, refused to remove his suit, sweat pouring down his face inside the helmet. He told them all to take 3 days off to go home and rest. One of the nurses, her hands still shaking, wiped the fog from her visor and asked him if the contamination sickness was really just a disease. Albright gave a bitter laugh and said he didn't know. He had heard a theory from the research division that what they were seeing wasn't a sickness but an evolution. And evolution, he mused, always went hand in hand with extinction. He advised them to prepare themselves. In the locker room, Elias turned on the faucet, the cold water rushing over his hands. But he kept them clenched into tight fists. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. A placid, unreadable face. No joy, no shock, no fear. No one knew what he was thinking. And no one had noticed what he had done in the final moments of the surgery. He turned off the water, dried his hands, and slid one into his pocket. As his fingers uncurled, a voice, crisp and electronic, echoed not in his ears, but directly inside his skull. Congratulations, host. You have awakened the omniscience talent. Item acquired. Royal parasite larva, unhatched, Class A. You may call me the system. In your limited framework, this is the most scientific explanation for my existence. I know your thoughts. You are not infected. I am your talent, your ability. Those who are contaminated by a source are designated contaminants. Those who are exposed but awaken a talent instead are designated the awakened. This reality will become public knowledge in a matter of months. You've already met one of the awakened, Cole Armstrong. And now you are one too. A weak one, but you have me. And I am a most exceptional talent. You won. No, not you. I chose you. Elias's eyes snapped open. He went home, turned on the television. The news was still focused on the northern quarantine zones. A reporter, smiling brightly, assured the public that the situation was under control and that this strain of the sickness was not contagious. The viewers wouldn't know she was broadcasting from a secure studio in a different state, hundreds of miles from the danger zone. The year was 2031, and the world was, on the surface, at peace. Elias pulled back his curtains and looked down at the street below. Commuters crowded a bus stop. College students argued on a street corner. Nothing had changed. If not for the surgery, he would have believed nothing ever would. That tiny golden egg was now buried in a pot of soil on his balcony. As he had planted it, the system's voice had buzzed with incessant commentary. It may be a low-grade contaminant, but as the larva of a royal parasite, it has a unique function. Think of it like a shark evolution game. Once hatched, your royal can devour the larvae of other, lesser parasites. And really, it's 2031. Does any surgeon still believe traditional medicine can do anything against the sickness? The moment Elias put down the small trowel, his phone rang, the sound jarringly loud. He answered. It was Dr. Riley. His voice was a raw, desperate rasp. He pleaded for Elias's help. Riley told him he didn't know who else to call, that he was terrified of going to a hospital. It was winter, but Port Gallows was temperate. Beneath his heavy coat, Riley's arm was a mess of bloody scratches. His fingernails were packed with his own flesh. He didn't seem to notice the self-inflicted wounds, his sharp nails continuing to tear at his skin, where a series of small, translucent blisters had appeared, each one eerily similar to the sacks they had removed in surgery. He was sitting on a park bench, shivering uncontrollably despite his layers of clothing. The gestating larvae were draining his body heat to survive. His frantic, wild-eyed appearance made the early morning joggers give him a wide berth. Elias asked what had happened. Riley, his voice a choked whisper, told him the things were growing on his arm, the same things from the surgery. Elias understood immediately. He told Riley he needed to contact the Contamination Control Center. When the sickness first appeared overseas years ago, there had been a brief global panic before experts classified it as a new kind of infectious disease and containment protocols were established. But Riley was hysterical, shaking his head frantically. He said he had interned at a CCC facility in college. He knew they didn't treat people. They incinerated them. He didn't want to die. He begged Elias to help him, reminding him of what the captain had said, that if the eggs were cut out, he could be saved. It was a doctor's duty to save lives. It was why he had called Elias the most dedicated doctor he had ever known. Before Elias could respond, a sharp knock echoed from his front door. He told Riley he would call him back. He activated the digital peephole. The screen showed two men. One of them was Captain Cole Armstrong. He was out of uniform today, dressed in jeans, a dark jacket, and sneakers, looking more like a college student than a soldier. Armstrong spoke towards the camera. He said hello, introduced himself again, and explained that due to the infectious nature of the previous night's procedure, he had brought a colleague to perform a routine health screening. He held up an ID from the Port Gallows Contamination Control Center. The ID identified him as an inspector. Elias opened the door. Armstrong stepped inside, his eyes subtly scanning the apartment. It was as sterile as a model home, devoid of personal touches. The cutting board in the open-plan kitchen was pristine. But Armstrong's gaze lingered on an archery target mounted on the living room wall, peppered with tight groupings of holes. The inspector set up a briefcase on the dining table and softly explained that the test required a small blood sample. Elias silently extended his arm. The blood was drawn and placed into a small, square device. A few minutes later, the inspector declared him free of any contamination. He advised Elias to contact the CCC if he experienced any fever or other symptoms. Elias looked the man directly in the eye and asked if the sickness was truly just an infectious disease. The inspector gave a practiced, reassuring response, calling it a novel genetic disorder that, while highly contagious, was now largely under control thanks to global scientific efforts. In Elias's mind, the system scoffed. That was only because the initial outbreaks were all low-grade contaminants. A single Class C can annihilate a city. And by the way, it advised you should get these two out of here if you don't want to end up in a research lab. Elias, sensing the conversation was over, thanked them. Moments after the two men left, Armstrong's voice came through Elias's phone, though he was already down the hall. Armstrong noted that obsessive cleanliness was a common symptom of OCD. The inspector reported that the living environment was clean, with no contamination source. He then recited Elias's file. Father was one of the first contaminants a decade ago, had a criminal record for fraud. Mother committed suicide when he was 6. Elias suffered long-term abuse and confinement by his father, was rescued at 12, diagnosed with photophobia, claustrophobia, and dissociative identity disorder with a highly aggressive alternate personality. He was declared fully recovered and released from psychiatric care at 16. The same year, his father, now a contaminant-designated Subject 18, was captured. 2 years ago, Subject 18 became the only Class A contaminant to ever escape a research facility, an event that proved high-level contaminants possess human-level intelligence. Armstrong asked his partner, whose name was Linton, what he sensed. Linton, an awakened with the talent of premonition, said he felt a dangerous aura from Elias. But the test results were clear. His variance level was 0. A normal human. Armstrong lit a military-grade tranquilizer cigarette and said it was a shame. He thought Elias might have had the potential to be one of them. He took a drag and said it was time to head to their next stop. A variance level between 0 and 100 was still considered human. An awakened was someone who had been exposed, developed a talent, and kept their variance below 100. Anything over 100 was no longer human. It was a contaminant. And Elias Vance was a 0. Dr. Riley waited for Elias's call, growing colder and colder on the park bench. The world around him began to fade, the colors bleeding out into a hazy gray. A thick fog rolled in from the river. High fever was making him delirious, but a prickle of instinct made him look up. 2 men in plain clothes were approaching him with purpose. He knew with absolute certainty they were from the CCC. He was going to be captured, incinerated like the things he'd seen in those labs years ago. Without a second thought, Riley scrambled to his feet and ran. The 2 agents were surprised by his sudden flight and gave chase. Riley had never been athletic. A long surgery could leave him exhausted for days. Yet now he ran with an impossible speed, his body light as the wind. His hearing had become unnaturally sharp. He could hear the agents cursing his speed from 100 yards back. He didn't understand why his body had changed so much. He didn't have time to. The thumping sound of a helicopter grew overhead. He looked up to see a military chopper, its side door open. Captain Armstrong, secured by a harness, was aiming a sniper rifle at him. His amplified voice boomed across the park, ordering him to stop and put his hands on his head. He identified himself and informed Riley he was infected and needed to come in for treatment, that they would use force if he refused. Riley ignored him, his legs pumping madly. A drop of sweat ran down Armstrong's temple as the command came through his earpiece. The target was now a mobile infection source. Lethal force was authorized. Armstrong squeezed the trigger. His talent was tracking shot, an ability that guaranteed a hit within range. From a moving helicopter hundreds of feet in the air, it was an impossible shot. But the bullet found its mark. A spray of red erupted from Riley's body. But he did not fall. In a horrifying spectacle, Riley's headless body continued to sprint forward. Armstrong, his face a mask of grim focus, fired twice more in quick succession. The heavy-caliber rounds should have obliterated him. Like a parasite controlling its host, the thing inside Riley was still in command. A sudden downpour began, and in the torrential rain, the body finally reached its destination, the Port Gallows Ship Canal. It leaped joyfully into the churning water. The corpse was recovered quickly. Armstrong, ignoring the risk, tore away Riley's clothes. There were no more egg sacs on his body. No one was relieved. The infection was now in the river. The two agents who had lost him stood with their heads bowed in shame, apologizing for not being able to keep up. Normally, gestation had 3 distinct phases over several weeks. Riley had progressed from infection to advanced mutation in mere hours. This was unprecedented. Humans evolved, but so did the contaminants. Armstrong's expression was thunderous as he radioed his report. A new outbreak event, classification pending. Class C parasite, mutated strain. Recovery of host failed. Contamination spread unknown. He requested immediate backup from headquarters. Elias kept trying to call Riley, but the phone just rang until it went to voicemail. Later, it was off. His text messages went unanswered. Though they were colleagues, they weren't close enough to know each other's addresses. Not long after Armstrong's visit, a substantial sum of money was deposited into Elias's bank account, compensation for the surgery. It was the largest bonus he'd ever received. With his mandated time off, he decided not to go into the hospital. Most people, upon receiving a windfall, would treat themselves. Elias considered this, then went to the convenience store downstairs and bought every bottle of water and package of instant noodles they had. The clerk was listening to a talk radio show. A news bulletin reported that police had cornered an armed fugitive in Riverside Park that morning. The fugitive had attempted to take a hostage and was shot and killed on sight. Elias remembered Riley's last words on the phone. He had said he was in a park by the river. Elias searched online for news about the incident, but every report was a carbon copy of the official press release, with no details about the suspect. He finally found one blurry aerial photo. A figure in a black jacket lay on the ground. Elias recognized the jacket. Riley had worn it to the hospital once, proudly stating it was an expensive gift from his girlfriend. A seed of dread began to sprout in Elias's gut. He drove to the nearest wholesale club and began to shop with a singular, desperate focus. The store employees, unaccustomed to a customer buying supplies like he was stocking a fallout shelter, had to arrange for a small truck to deliver his purchases. Food, medicine, bottled water, portable gas burners. The goods filled 2 of his spare bedrooms. The delivery guy, baffled, asked him what he was preparing for. Elias, not a man for explanations, replied that he was starting an online retail business. That evening, as Elias was preparing dinner with the evening news on as usual, the anchor's expression suddenly shifted. She announced they were interrupting the broadcast with an emergency bulletin. An unidentified contaminant strain had been detected in the city. All non-essential activities were suspended. All residents were ordered to shelter in place. Port Gallows was officially under lockdown. The message went out to millions of residents simultaneously. A wave of panic washed over the city. The message board for his condo building exploded with activity. People were confused, angry. They demanded to know what was happening, how it could be so sudden. For most, the contamination sickness was a distant problem, a plague that happened in other countries. The initial fear from years ago had faded into a dull background hum of news reports. They never imagined it could happen here, in their home. The building management posted a message, reassuring residents that while they were confined, essential services and grocery deliveries would continue. In his hospital work group chat, his colleagues were debating whether they would be drafted into service. They worried about patients whose surgeries were now indefinitely postponed. They wondered why even doctors were being forced to quarantine at home. They knew more than the average person, but only slightly. The treatment of the sickness had long ago been taken out of the realm of traditional medicine. It was a military and scientific problem now. They still thought of it as a severe but manageable epidemic like AIDS or a deadly flu. Only Elias, staring at the screen, his face grim, knew the truth. He remembered the golden eggs. Armstrong had said they weren't contagious, but Riley had mutated. Earlier in the day, he had called Dr. Albright, only to be told the chief of surgery was on a plane to his family's home in the Midwest. Albright was fine. Only Riley had been directly exposed to the fluid from the ruptured sac. The lockdown was brutally efficient. The next morning, Elias looked out his window, which overlooked the main gate of his condo complex. An armored military vehicle was parked there, and soldiers with rifles were taking up positions. The main gate was sealed, and even the doors to each individual building were locked from the outside. They were only opened for a few minutes each day for deliveries. On the second night of the lockdown, a single gunshot echoed in the distance, setting off a chain reaction of shrieking car alarms. Elias rose and peered through a crack in his blinds. He saw a familiar shape, the rectangular metal pod, the same kind used for the soldier, being carried out of the complex by men in hazmat suits. The next morning, the building's message board was buzzing about the noise. Management quickly posted an explanation, claiming a burglar had been caught by the military patrol and that the situation was resolved. Elias looked at the message, then put down his phone. He was about to wash an apple for breakfast when the system spoke. "I would advise against using the tap water today. Did you know that, in their ungestated state, these particular parasite larvae are completely transparent?" Elias retracted his hand. He decided an unwashed apple was probably fine. While he ate, the system provided a detailed explanation. In the first stage of gestation, the larvae enter the stomach, hatch, and reproduce asexually. This can last up to 2 weeks. In the second stage, the larvae travel through the bloodstream and lodge in fatty tissues, absorbing nutrients and eventually appearing on the skin. In the third stage, they cover the entire body. At that point, the host becomes a low-level contaminant, typically a frogmorph. The system's tone was disturbingly cheerful. Elias opened his phone and posted an anonymous message on every local forum and social media group he could find, urging people to drink only bottled water. Then he looked up the number for the Port Gallows CCC. He felt he had a duty to warn them. The system interrupted him. "If I were you, I wouldn't make that call. An awakened won't necessarily be taken to a research facility. But you will, because you are Subject 18's son, and because you have me as your talent. They have regretted losing your father for a decade. They are not going to miss their chance with you. Trust me, I would much rather stay with you than be dissected in a lab. You're quite handsome, after all." For the first time, Elias responded to the voice, asking what would happen to him in a lab. The system gave a dry, humorless laugh. Death would be the best possible outcome. But as a priceless specimen, you would not be allowed to die easily. Elias did not want to be dissected. He deleted the number from his phone. His anxiety manifested as a need for order. He began cleaning his already spotless apartment. The official response was, in fact, swift. That afternoon, the water for the entire city was shut off. Elias heard his neighbor, a young rich kid named Kevin, yelling from his balcony about it. The building's message board erupted in chaos. The official story, broadcast on the local news channel, the only channel still working, was that a chemical spill at the water treatment plant had contaminated the municipal supply. The anchor, broadcasting from his own home, promised that the military would begin distributing clean water to all residents. Most people believed it. They knew about the sickness, but they couldn't comprehend its true horror. Fear of death is a primal instinct. If the full truth were revealed, the city's fragile peace would shatter. A mass exodus would begin, and if even one person carrying the parasite escaped, the plague would go global. The system chuckled in his mind. A runaway train is heading for a split in the track. On one side, a single person is tied to the rails. On the other, 100 people. Which way do you steer? It then added that fear itself was a catalyst. The more people panicked, the more susceptible they became to contamination. If the media told the truth, the world would fall in a month. As it was, it wouldn't be much longer. Elias noted the system seemed to be looking forward to it. The city remained locked down. By the third week, the nightly gunshots were a regular occurrence. Elias found his hearing had become more acute. He needed earplugs to sleep. The authorities began door-to-door testing, taking away anyone who showed signs of infection. No one knew if they were being taken for treatment or incineration. The city's communication network was now completely cut off from the outside world. Then, a screenshot of a social media post began to circulate within the city's firewalled internet. A terrified woman wrote that her boyfriend was starting to look and act like a frog. She was hiding from him in her bedroom, begging for someone to help her. The accompanying photo was blurry but horrifying. A man was crouched on the floor in a toad-like posture. His eyeballs bulged from their sockets, held in place only by stretched, red veins. A strange, slimy membrane covered his skin, and his mouth was split into a ghastly grin. Most people who saw it dismissed it as a sick joke. Elias knew it was real. The system commented that this was merely a bottom-tier F-class contaminant. Barely a person anymore. It added that while disgusting to look at, the meat was surprisingly tasty. Elias felt a wave of nausea. He heated up a bowl of instant noodles with bottled water to calm his nerves. Because of the water shutoff, a building maintenance worker delivered a small case of bottled water to each unit every morning. A few times, Elias had been slow to retrieve his, and when he opened his door, he found half the case was gone. But in its place was a thick wad of cash, $1,000. He took the money. Whoever it was, they were desperate. He had stockpiled enough supplies for himself. He decided to find out who his mysterious, wealthy water thief was. The next day, he sat by his door, watching the feed from his security camera. At 9:30 a.m., 10 minutes after the water was delivered, the door across the hall opened. A young man crept out. It was Kevin, his rich neighbor. The kid was wearing a heavy beanie pulled down low, despite the warmth of the building. He scurried over, took half of Elias's water, left another $1,000 and scurried back. Elias paused the video and zoomed in. Kevin's fingers were unnaturally long and almost translucent, the blood vessels visible beneath the skin. The system confirmed it. The boy was infested and dehydrated. Elias's first instinct was to report him, but his scientific curiosity won out. He asked the system if he could handle an F-class contaminant on his own. The system told him it was a toss-up. After all, Elias was a bottom-tier awakened himself. But this type could still be killed by conventional physical means. Elias put his phone down and retrieved his composite bow from under his bed. On the 7th day of the lockdown, late at night, a faint scratching sound came from his front door. Elias looked at his clock. 3 a.m. He grabbed his bow and the military-grade combat knife he'd bought online years ago and crept to the door. The digital peephole showed Kevin. His skin was now a mottled green, like pond scum. His eyes were vacant, the pupils wide. His long fingers were picking at the lock. A translucent slime dripped from them. The system's voice was mocking. The toad has come for the swan. Kevin's voice, distorted and wet, came through the door. I know you're in there, Elias. I know you like me too. I have a way for us to be together forever. The next second, his long, forked tongue shot out, slithered into the keyhole, and began manipulating the tumblers. Elias silently drew the bowstring. A moment later, the lock clicked. The door swung open a crack. Kevin was plastered against it, his voice a soft, wet whisper. Why won't you open the door, Elias? Elias was behind a large cabinet, a perfect firing position. He let the arrow fly. It struck Kevin in the neck but only penetrated an inch into the tough, rubbery flesh. The creature shrieked in pain and fury and leaped into the room, its head nearly touching the ceiling, moving with a speed that defied physics.
Roll!
The system screamed in his head. Elias Dove grabbing his knife. The creature landed heavily, its acidic saliva sizzling on the floorboards. The system informed him that the creature's weak point was its abdomen, just like the frogs he had dissected in medical school. Elias's survival instinct took over. He dodged and weaved, but the creature was too fast. It tackled him, pinning him to the floor, its hands closing around his neck. It seemed confused by his lack of fear. Food was always best seasoned with terror. It pried open his eyelid with a slimy finger. "Let's start with the eyes," it gurgled. "They're so beautiful." Its long tongue unspooled from its mouth, heading for his eyeball. This was the moment Elias had been waiting for. His calm expression twisted into a mask of feral intensity. His hand, the hand of a surgeon, was perfectly steady as he drove the combat knife deep into the creature's soft belly. The fight was over. To be sure, he stabbed it several more times. When he emerged from the shower, the contaminant on his floor was cold. He began to clean. Blood was difficult, but a saline solution mixed with potassium permanganate worked wonders. While he worked, he made notes in a journal. Frogmorph, saliva highly corrosive, skin is tough and waterproof, vulnerable abdomen, fast twitch muscle fibers suggest high burst speed but poor endurance. When he was done, he dismembered the corpse. He ground the flesh in a heavy-duty disposal unit and flushed it down the toilet. The system lamented the waste of such delicious meat. Elias felt nothing but disgust. A person, at the very least, should not eat another person. The next morning, he was woken by a knock. It was the building maintenance man, a young man named Sean, asking if he'd seen Kevin. Sean's own eyes were beginning to bulge, and he was constantly sipping from a water bottle. Elias said he didn't know where Kevin was. Sean told him that was the last water delivery. He was being transferred to a reception center, the official term for the camps where the infected were taken. He said everyone was afraid of him now. He told Elias to be careful, that he smelled different from other people, more appetizing. He also mentioned he had erased the security footage from the night of Kevin's disappearance. He thanked Elias for saving his leg in a construction accident years before, the surgery that had led to him taking this job. Then he left, hopping down the hall. That night, the city broadcast a formal address. The true nature of the sickness was revealed to the public. The spread was through the water supply. The stages of mutation were described. They were told that the infected were no longer human. They were urged to report anyone showing symptoms. The last veil was torn away, and the city drowned in a tidal wave of terror and despair. Thousands of miles away, on the newly fortified border of the Port Gallows quarantine zone, now a massive, seamless wall of earth that stretched for miles, erected by a powerful awakened, Captain Cole Armstrong gave his report to his superior. The man, whose talent was the manipulation of earth, told him he could only hold the wall for 1 week. If the city wasn't pacified by then, the military would resort to thermobaric weapons. In a darkened room somewhere else entirely, a figure in a black robe watched the Port Gallows situation on a monitor. A second voice, emanating from the back of the figure's own head, spoke with glee. The reception centers are the perfect incubators. Only through consumption can true evolution be achieved. It spoke of a royal larva, sent into the city as a catalyst. It acknowledged that the son of Subject 18 was in the city, but dismissed it as unimportant. The sacrifices were necessary for the birth of a god. The wind blew back the figure's hood, revealing a face with a single vertical eye. On the back of its head, a second face, constantly shifting, smiled with fanatical devotion. Port Gallows, it whispered, was only the beginning. Elias was cleaning again when he knocked over the planter on his balcony. The pot shattered, and the soil spilled across the floor. The small, golden egg he had buried weeks ago rolled to a stop at his feet. It was shrunken from dehydration but still pulsed with a faint inner light. He picked it up with a pair of tweezers. He asked the system how to use it to fight poison with poison. The system explained that one path of evolution for an awakened was to merge with a contaminant. The process would raise his own variance level and was irreversible and not guaranteed to succeed. But, it added, Elias had already been told that Port Gallows was just the beginning. The world was on fire, and this was the only way to fight back. As your talent, it purred, what bad intentions could I possibly have? Now, are you ready to begin?